So in 2014, Andres, Lorenzo, and I, three linguists, we embarked on a typical linguistic fieldwork trip to Patagonia to study the bilingualism of the speakers who speak Spanish and Afrikaans. So we would drive to the speakers' homes, record them, and then drive back to our hotel. And very often on our car rides back to the hotel, we would say amongst ourselves, you know, these speakers have a story to tell. And we need historians, we need anthropologists to help us out. It's a shame that somebody isn't here with us to kind of give us more guidance, to kind of approach this community in a broader light. So that kind of was left on the back burner because we are not anthropologists or historians. And then 2 years later, in 2016, the collaboratory grants were announced. And right away, Lorenzo, Andres, and I said, we've got to apply for a grant, and we need to find other collaborators who are not linguists and make this not an intra, but an interdisciplinary collaboration. And the first person on our list was Paulina Alberto. She is an expert in 20th century Argentinian history. Right away, I contacted her, and she said, yes, I'm more than happy to help out.
Hi, my name is Paulina Alberto. I'm an Associate Professor of History and Romance Languages and Literatures here at the University of Michigan. My trajectory as a collaborator in this project has been one of increasing involvement. One of the turning points I can think of is when I had a chance to help shape the second round of interviews, the most recent research trip, because the team's first trip in 2014 was composed entirely of linguists, and their methods for collecting information, the questions they were asking, weren't really meant to get at history, identity, culture, ethnicity, all of these kinds of things. So what we did in order to try to get at these questions was that we came up with a series of prompts to ask the people in the community. They were guided by earlier interviews, quotes from earlier interviews that we found really intriguing and that we wanted people to expand on, terms that they used that we wanted to see how they defined those terms of identity sometimes, and archival documents, including some photos. So we were able to show some photos from earlier moments in the community's histories and get people to reflect on that. The arrival of the Boer community in the 20th century and their positive reception by the Argentine government is really part of this bigger story, these bigger narratives and images of Argentina. Starting in the mid to late 19th century, the Argentine state set out to sort of put into motion a range of policies that were meant to, as elites saw it, improve the local Argentine population. By which they really meant making local Argentines more modern and more European, both in terms of their culture and their racial background. For the central piece of this range of policies was to attempt to promote European immigration, in part by offering potential settlers their own land. So between 1880 and 1916, almost 3 million immigrants came to Argentina, most of them of European origin, and this was a massive transformation for the country. And by 1914, when the Argentine state took the census of the population, they proudly declared that the country had become homogeneously white, and that the populations of African descent and the indigenous populations, which had been more numerous in the colonial period in the 19th century, had dwindled down to such insignificant proportions that it wasn't even worth counting them. So in some ways, the arrival of a community of white, Christian, industrious, hardworking farmers, right, the Boers from South Africa, and the state's grant of land to this group of people really fits squarely within this story of the state's attempt to sort of improve or reshape the Argentine population or repopulate the supposedly deserted Argentine landscape with new people. But to me, what's fascinating about this community is that as much as it fits within this kind of dominant vision of Argentina and these dominant narratives of immigration and whitening, their story, if we sort of look more closely, their story really also challenges that dominant narrative in some interesting ways.
The community's recollections actually allow us to catch a glimpse of a vibrant multi-ethnic world behind this seemingly cohesive and isolated community. So we see connections with local mixed-race, Spanish-speaking farmhands and laborers. We see connections with indigenous groups, even some members of the Boer community who learned how to speak some indigenous languages and to work with the local population. And we know also that there's a story of increasing intermarriage with local Argentines, less so in the earlier years, but increasingly by the middle of the century, and even with some Chileans.
And I think that these oral histories that we've uncovered as a team offer multiple clues to kind of reconstructing this multi-ethnic world that existed. I think if we can kind of show the particular ways that ideas about race and racial difference are constructed differently in different times and places, then I think it helps people denaturalize ideas about race in their own society, and it helps with showing the ways in which ideas about race are just that, they're just ideas, right? They don't have a kind of core biological fixed reality in nature. I'm in the middle of writing my second book about the histories of Afro-Argentines and also the stories surrounding specific Afro-Argentine people who were famous. The intersections with my own work began to be more evident and more difficult to ignore, and that really began to sort of lure me in deeper.
I'm particularly interested in learning more about the history of two native South African Black men who came over with the early settlers and whose names recur over and over in the stories that the modern day community tells about its own history.
So the interviewees' stories, these stories that circulated in the Afrikaner community, I find them extremely compelling. I'm interested in thinking about how different people tell those stories, how the stories reinforce each other, but also have some interesting contradictions. But I find it as something that I want to explore as an unknown chapter of the history of Afro-Argentines.
Paulina's role has changed from a consultant, which is someone who offers information, offers background information, historical context about this community, to a full collaborator, which is someone who is intellectually invested in this project and who will ultimately write papers, be first author on papers related to this community. And so one really nice anecdote where I've seen her transformation from becoming a consultant to a collaborator was a couple of weeks ago in mid-October. As the data started coming in from the 2018 fieldwork trip, Paulina, I think, picked up on the richness of the data, on what we were finding and how it intersected with her own research. And so one Friday evening, I received an email from Paulina, and she says to me, "Nick, I've got this really good idea, but it's too long to write over email. Would you mind giving me a phone call?" And so I called her up, and we talked for about a half an hour about different ideas that she wanted to implement to kind of advance our collaboration. But I think that willingness to email me and to talk on the phone showed her investment in this project and showed her willingness to become an intellectual collaborator, and that there was something that she was getting out of this project that was of intellectual benefit to her. She was no longer feeding us information. Suddenly the project was feeding her information.